The Crow, directed by Rupert Sanders, starring Bill Skarsgård and FKA Twigs, came out this weekend, and I went to go see it in theaters. So, full disclosure, I had never seen the 1994 version of The Crow, starring Brandon Lee, until just yesterday, and then today I went to go see The New Crow in theaters. So I don't have this nostalgia attached to the 1994 version that probably a lot of people do. I knew that it was highly talked about, but I had never seen it, like I said, until just yesterday. So I wanted to watch the 1994 version first, because I didn't want like a first time watching bias or a recency bias or whatever that kind of bias would be. I wanted that to be my first experience with The Crow, and then I wanted to watch the 2024 remake with Bill Skarsgård. And I'm really glad I did that, because I have to say that I really, really, really enjoyed the 1994 version of The Crow starring Brandon Lee. I liked it way better than this remake that came out this weekend. The one that came out this weekend was okay. It wasn't a horrible movie. It wasn't a great movie. It was a pretty mid movie. If you looked at the Rotten Tomato score, you would think it was a horrible movie. I don't think I would go quite that far, but it just wasn't anything special, which is sad, unfortunate. It could have been something pretty good. It just didn't have it. It was mid. It was very mid. And that was disappointing. I'm going to go through some comparisons between the two and kind of work through what I liked about the 1994 version, what I liked about the 2024 version, what I didn't like about each one, and just kind of compare and contrast in that sort of manner, because I think it's interesting. I'm glad I had this experience of seeing them both for the first time in rapid succession. Like I said, I don't have nostalgia attached to the 1994 Crow with Brandon Lee like a lot of people do, which may be unfortunate, but at the same time it maybe gives me a more objective lens to judge the two films. So that's nice, at least. So the 1994 version, starring Brandon Lee, first of all, it has a very, very specific vibe. It is what I would call very stylized. It's almost hyper stylized. It's very grungy. The set of the city almost looks comic book-ish, cartoonish. It looks fake at times, but it works so well with the aesthetic of the film. And I think it's very fitting given that this is an adaptation of a comic book or a comic strip. So it was hyper stylized in that manner. It's grungy. It's almost not real looking at times. It's comic book looking. And I think that fits. For instance, there's some shots of the cityscape, and you can almost kind of tell that these building tops are just set pieces. They're not real buildings. It doesn't feel like a huge film. It feels contained within this little city. There's the scene where Brandon Lee pops out of a grave, which looks, the realism isn't there, but that's the point. It's the aesthetic. It's like a comic book aesthetic. It's not meant to look realistic per se. It's meant to be a certain style. And I really appreciate that because it really works in the movie. It doesn't take you out of the world. It, in fact, basically immerses you into the world even more. The 2024 version of The Crow with Bill Skarsgård is definitely not stylized in that manner. And I would say it's much more grounded aesthetically. I understand the choice, but I just don't think it worked as well as the 1994 version. I think there was a reason that they went with that aesthetic and that style. Like I said, the style of the 1994 version made it feel contained. It made the story feel contained. Even though it was supposed to take place in a city, it felt like a contained story. The remake that came out this weekend felt too sprawling. It felt too wide. It felt too all-encompassing, and it didn't feel like a smaller contained story. And I like a good contained story. I like movies like Signs that happen basically on a farm and in a little farmhouse. I like those kinds of movies that are contained in a certain locale and that are contained story-wise. Brandon Lee brought more humor to The Crow, which I think was needed, because I would argue that the crime that is committed against Eric and Shelley in the 1994 version is actually a lot more dark, just because it deals with not just murder, but some other things in there as well. And you really feel the gravity of that. And I think in that regard, the 1994 version is certainly darker, but it's also balanced with more humor. There was a couple times I laughed at some of the lines or some of the mannerisms that Brandon Lee delivered when I was watching the movie last night. Whereas I don't think I laughed a single time in the 2024 version that I watched today in the theaters. I like a good somber drama that doesn't have laughs. I like movies like that. But in this case, I think it would have helped to balance the film a little bit more had it had a little bit more humor, just so it's not so sullen the whole time. It can be good to have balance there. So I appreciated that about the 1994 version as opposed to the one that came out this weekend. I think one of the biggest failings of this modern rehashing of The Crow is that I don't know if they bite off more than they can chew with this, or if they just have too broad a scope. I think they go into too deep of backstory, certainly. For some reason, it just didn't work nearly as well for me that they gave you Eric and Shelley's complete relationship backstory. For some reason, I didn't care about their relationship nearly as much as I did in the 1994 version, which is really strange because they give you almost no context or pre-knowledge of Eric and Shelley's relationship in Brandon Lee's version of The Crow. It's just given to you in little bits and pieces and flashbacks, and not that much is given to you. But for some reason, I was very much more invested in Brandon Lee and Sophia's version of Eric and Shelley. And I believe Brandon Lee's pain and heartbreak a lot more than I believe Bill Skarsgård's in regard to the death of his loved one. And I'm not sure exactly why that is. Again, I think it has something to do with the 1994 version of The Crow trusted its audience to get thrust into this world and figure it out as it went. Whereas I feel like there's too much explanation that goes on in this modern rehashing. There's too much backstory, and the backstory doesn't work enough. Had it worked really well, it might have been okay. I don't know if the casting of FKA Twigs as Shelley maybe could have been better. I realize she's a musical artist and maybe not necessarily an actress, so maybe if you had cast that better, it maybe would have been more believable or more impactful. I'm not exactly sure what it was, but it was not nearly as believable. I did not feel as emotionally invested in this couple as I did in the 1994 version. And I think that is really key for this story, because it's kind of the driving force behind you wanting to see the revenge that The Crow brings, right? It has the emotional heart behind it, if you can pull that off. And it loses a lot of its emotional heart if that relationship doesn't work. And it just didn't work for me in this 2024 version. It was okay, but it just didn't work. I think Bill Skarsgård did a very good job portraying Eric, but I just think Brandon Lee's version of Eric, or The Crow, was much more compelling. Like I said, there was more range in emotion. He was funny at times, and he was very emotionally distraught at times. And I just think kind of that manic representation of him on screen was very much more fitting to this man who was brutally murdered, comes back from the dead, is kind of half dead, half alive, very emotionally distraught. It's very off-kilter. Brandon Lee does a very good off-kilter performance. In fact, if someone told me that Heath Ledger had taken inspiration for his Joker from Brandon Lee's Crow, I would completely believe them, because there was definitely moments where I was just like, wow, that's kind of a Heath Ledger Joker-esque kind of off-kilter humor and horror almost. And I just really liked that. Bill Skarsgård was more just kind of a sad, moody guy, and it wasn't nearly as much range as I maybe would have liked. I think eliminating the character of, what was her name? Sarah, I believe. Yes, the little girl named Sarah in the 1994 version of The Crow. I think eliminating that character was a mistake, because I think for whatever reason she also brought a lot of heart to this story. She gives the opening and closing narration in the 1994 version of The Crow. So it's this innocent little girl who cared for these people who had to go through their murder and who is now witnessing their revenge. And just the innocence and the love that she has for Eric and Shelley is very sweet, and it brings a lot more heart, I think, to the film as well. And so I think also eliminating that character from the 2024 version of The Crow was probably a mistake. Let's talk villains. So I also liked the villain a lot more. in the 1994 version of The Crow. I thought, there was enough kind of like mystical supernatural elements with him and his whatever she was to him, but it was relatively, he was just kind of a villain. He was just kind of a bad guy. He was just kind of a chaotic bad guy. And there wasn't a lot of supernatural elements to him, at least that I saw. Obviously, there's some with his colleague or counterpart there, but for the most part, he's just kind of a bad dude. And I thought that worked better because it just seemed to get a little hokey in the 2024 version, where you have this guy who's made a deal with the devil for immortality, and he kills innocent people to maintain this deal with the devil. It just seemed messy, it seemed weird, and it seemed a little bit hokey. And in a more grounded version of the film, it was weird that kind of went more supernatural and hokey than maybe the 1994 version. The villains just weren't that interesting to me in this modern rehashing of The Crow. I was much more intrigued and kind of repulsed, I guess you'd say, by the villains in the 1994 version, because they're just so chaotic in that version with Brandon Lee, and they're so off the wall, but they give really good performances, whereas in the 2024 version it just seemed like they were very dull and just kind of same. The fight sequences with the villains, it was just a lot of carnage. I feel like they went too far with the concept of the Crow being invincible in this version with Bill Skarsgård, because he was just getting torn up left and right, but he kind of just powered through it. And at a certain point, I was just kind of getting tired of the carnage. I was getting tired of seeing people get killed. I was tired of seeing him get shot and sliced and diced and run over. And in the 1994 version, he is getting shot. He is getting beat up, and he does regenerate, but it's a lot less gratuitous, I would say. It's just it's more balanced. I didn't get tired of the revenge fight scenes in the 1994 version, but I was starting to get tired of them in this new version that came out this weekend. So that's unfortunate, because that's kind of the fun part of the movie, right? The revenge part is the fun part, where you see justice done, where you see people get their just desserts, but it just got tiresome after a while. So that is something else between the two that the 1994 version just did much, much better. I would say the one thing that I appreciated a lot about this modern rehashing almost 30 years later is that obviously film technology and special effects have come a long way. So the movie was very pretty. There was some really cool moments that I enjoyed. For instance, when the guy in the kind of in-between world, whoever this dude is, the first time he says, well, wake up, and then he pushes him into a puddle, and then he comes out alive. That was a cool scene where he dives out the window into this, kind of limbo world toward the end with the main villain. That was a cool aesthetic scene. I mean, there was it's a pretty movie, and there were some really cool aesthetic CG choices in the movie. So that was good about it. Like, it was a pretty movie. I appreciated the aesthetics of the movie. But again, I appreciated the aesthetics of the 1994 version. They were just a lot more stylized. It was a much different style. The one thing that I would say I did not like about the 1994 version, there was a couple scenes that had to deal with this. So there was a scene where he's with this policeman in his apartment. He comes to this policeman in his apartment, and there's a moment where he puts his hands on the policeman's head, and the memories of the crime scene transfer from the policeman to Eric, to the Crow. And he has this moment of pain because he's seen kind of the bigger picture of what happened at the crime scene. And this comes back at the end when he's fighting the villain, and kind of a decisive moment is Eric, or the Crow, puts his hands on the villain's head and says, now I'm giving you however many hours or days or weeks of pain in a moment. And this kind of takes the villain aback, and then he's able to defeat the villain. Those moments seemed a little bit kind of out of nowhere, convenient, forced. I don't know. They seemed a little bit odd. I didn't quite get that choice. Take that as you will. Overall, the vibe, the aesthetic, the music, the believability of the emotion, kind of the interesting off-kilter nature, the performances, I just liked everything a lot more in the 1994 version of The Crow with Brandon Lee. I understand why people like it. I really enjoyed it. So it was disappointing, I'll say, to watch this modern 2024 rehashing of The Crow 30 years later. They could have had so much time to take what, the little things that could have been improved from the original and to make something really great. Other than that, those couple scenes that were a little weird to me, the only gripe that I have with the 1994 version is just some dated aspects of it, like the punch sound effect. It's very much of that era, and it's kind of corny to use that today, or like the firearm sound effects and stuff like that. But that kind of adds to the camp of the movie too. There's a little bit of camp to the movie that's kind of fun. I was hoping that the 2024 version of The Crow would take the aspects of this beloved movie that maybe could have been improved slightly or thought out a little bit better, and really made something that was great for this modern time. But it just didn't do that. It's pretty much worse in every way, in my estimation. It's not one that I would really want to go back and see again, unfortunately, whereas the 1994 version is definitely one I would revisit. So yeah, for somebody who is completely new to the world of The Crow, who's never read the comic strip, who had never seen the 1994 version with Brandon Lee prior to yesterday, and who just watched the 2024 rehashing of it in theaters today, those are my thoughts on The Crow. Have a good one.